Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 31st edition of Chebacco Chats. We're glad to have our audience back with us, and I want to say right up front, thanks to Bar Harbor Bank and Trust for being the sponsor of this episode of Chebacco Chats. We really appreciate their support, and we're really happy to have Professor James O'Toole, the Clove Millennium Chair in History at Boston College. Professor O'Toole is the author of The Faithful, A History of Catholics in America, and he spends part of every summer in Spruce Head, Maine, over on the western shore of Penobscot Bay. And Jim, welcome to this episode of Chebacco Chats.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Well, you've written an article for the 2019 issue of Chebacco, one that focused on religious histories, and you happen to be an expert in the Catholic experience. And you went back to an episode in 1913 that connected the events 300 years earlier at Saint-Sauveur and looked at the lessons that were drawn from that event 300 years previously. Would you begin by reading to us from your article?
Sure. As spectacles go, this was not the grandest ever, but it was still a notable one in every respect, said one account. Solemn and inspiring, according to another. The participants had mostly arrived the day before, and on the morning of Wednesday, August 6th, 1913, they assembled, clad in the elaborate liturgical robes of the Roman Catholic Church. They had come to dedicate a new parish church building, and as a crowd of about 1,000 looked on, they began by walking around it in a procession, reciting the prescribed prayers, an account said, whereby the material edifice is dedicated and sanctified for divine services. Next, they went inside for a solemn mass, during which one of the prelates preached for nearly an hour on a text from 1 Corinthians, God it is that giveth the increase. The mass concluded, a formal banquet began in a nearby hotel, featuring toasts, speeches, and accompanying music. Though the audience was already well fatigued with the long exercises, one observer commented, yet they listened most attentively. Then it was back to the church for a service of Vespers with a shorter but still substantial sermon. And by the time everything ended around 10 o'clock that night, the impressive exercises had been deemed an unalloyed success. And that's a description of the dedication of the Holy Redeemer Church building on Mount Desert Street in Mount Desert.
And its facade is recognizable to anybody who's been to Bar Harbor, and it's the personages gathered in front that make it such an impressive photograph. And so one purpose was to dedicate this new church, and then there was another side of it too. Can you tell us the other reason this ceremony was held?
That's right. This church in Bar Harbor had been under construction for several years and was completed in 1910, but it hadn't yet been formally dedicated. And the Bishop of Portland, Maine, chose this occasion in August of 1913 to do that dedication, because he also wanted to make a larger point about the presence of Catholics in what became the state of Maine. He identified the earlier settlement, Saint-Sauveur on Mount Desert, 300 years before. And he wanted to use the dedication of this parish church building to celebrate 300 years, 1613 to 1913, 300 years of Catholic history in Maine.
But there was also, in addition to that, there was, and we'll get into it, but there was quite a present day purpose for this, a message to be delivered. But how did he how did he make the linkage between the significance of that event, 300 years, the Saint-Sauveur settlement, and what was going on in the present in 1913? What was the linkage between those two events?
Right. This was not a celebration of history just for its own sake. The Bishop Walsh, wanted to make a point not only about history, but also about the present. The Catholic community in Maine was still relatively small. Maybe about 15% of the population of Maine were Catholics at the time. This is just at the time of the First World War. And so Bishop Walsh wanted to make a statement about them and the present as well as the past. Catholics tended to be on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladders, and they had, even until fairly recent times, been subject to hostility, anti-Catholic sentiment, people who looked down on them because they were poorer than the rest of the population, and so on. And so what Bishop Walsh wanted to do by celebrating this 300 years of history was say, in effect, Catholics are here too. They're part of the community, and they've been a part of the community for a long period of time. So in effect, don't look down on Catholics just because they're not at the top of the social pile. They have a long history in Maine as well, and as much of a right, in a sense, to be there and to be a part of the larger Maine community as anybody else.
So in a way, he was kind of answering a climate that was somewhat opposed to Catholics or oppressive of Catholics. We're not too far removed from the rising of the Ku Klux Klan following the release of the film to Make a Nation.
Birth of a Nation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's right. That was the a part of the climate, and in the 19 teens and 20s, the Ku Klux Klan, especially here in New England, the Ku Klux Klan was as much an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant organization as it was an anti-Black organization. That wasn't true in other parts of the country, obviously, but that was a part of the climate that Walsh was trying to counter here. A couple of years before, a member of the Maine state legislature had introduced a so-called convent inspection bill. He was sure that nefarious things were going on inside the convents of Catholic sisters, and he wanted to pass a law that would make it possible for officials of the state to go inside and see what was going on. The bill didn't pass, but that too was a part of the general climate of suspicion of Catholics and hostility toward Catholics that Walsh was trying to counter, again, by saying, no, Catholics have been in Maine for 300 years. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing unpatriotic about them.
Yeah, and very conspiracy theories really had a way of setting the tone, right? The thing about what was going on in convents and other areas, they really tended to take their place in culture. I know we have a manuscript that outlines a conspiracy theory in our collection at the Historical Society.
That's right. That's right.
So this was organized. This was not just a local event. This was organized at a very high level. And here's a image of some of the people who put it together. Can you tell us how this was engaged, senior leadership of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, sure. First of all, seated there on the right, that's Bishop Lewis Walsh, who was the fourth man to be the Bishop of Portland, Maine. He had been appointed in 1906. So in 1913, he's still relatively new at his job. Walsh was a native of Salem, Massachusetts. Had been educated as a priest in Canada and France and Rome, and he came back to New England, where he taught at a seminary in Boston, and then was the first superintendent of the Catholic school system in Boston. So I think that background, among other things, made him always interested in teaching, and the events that he planned for Bar Harbor had a real educational purpose to them, I think. And so Walsh, again, fairly new in his job, wanted to arrange this ceremony to mark 300 years of Catholicism in Maine. And he started planning several years before, so that he could attract Catholic leaders from around the country and even from around the world. The other man seated here on the left is a man named Giovanni Bonzano, who was the representative of the Pope on these occasions. So again, as you say, it wasn't just a local celebration. Even a representative from the Pope came and served to make the event a special one. Bonzano was what was called the apostolic delegate to the United States. The United States and the Vatican didn't have formal diplomatic relations at the time, but in effect, that's what Bonzano was. So if Walsh is trying to make a statement, a larger statement about the nature of the Catholic Church and the history of it and the respectability of it even, having a representative of the Pope come to Bar Harbor, Maine was a way of making that statement. And the other men you see here were the other Catholic bishops from around New England.
And I don't know if this is how this pertains, Jim, but I think this is an old Catholic church. This is pre-Vatican II. And I wonder if that gave it the gathering and the people involved, a different cast to the whole event than we might react to it if we were to see something similar today.
Very much so. This would have been a much more elaborate ritual than a similar ritual of dedicating a parish church would be today. The religious purpose would still be the same, to officially make this a Catholic parish, but the ceremonies at the time, well, among other things, the ceremonies at the time would have been conducted entirely in Latin. So all the people who gathered wouldn't necessarily have been able to follow what was being said. But the ritual, the robes and vestments that they wore would all have been much more elaborate than anything we'd see today. And that too, I think, had a purpose of saying, well, this little parish church in a little corner of Maine is a part of this larger worldwide culture of Catholicism.
And maybe the different tone and expectations explain the patience that people had to sit in those pews for so long.
That's right.
For this ceremony, hours and hours.
Some minds probably wandered during the ceremony.
I want to invite our audience to pose questions. If you're watching on Zoom, use the chat or the Q&A function. If you're watching on Facebook Live, just go ahead and put a comment, and we'll try to make sure that we address your questions and comments. So Walsh had the idea that history could serve the needs of his congregation and his overall purpose. Can you tell us how that worked?
Yes, I think because he had these larger purposes in mind and was himself personally interested in history, as well as being a former teacher, I think he designed this occasion so that it could establish the long-standing traditions of Catholics in Maine. And there were actually several possibilities that he could have chosen to accomplish that purpose. There were other historical anniversaries around this same time, and he could have made something of all of them. One of them was when he came to Maine, he was only a couple of years shy of the 100th anniversary of the building of St. Patrick's Church just outside Damariscotta. St. Patrick's, which is still an active church today, is the oldest Catholic church building in New England. And so if Bishop Walsh was looking for a historical event to celebrate, he could have chosen that 100th anniversary of the church in Damariscotta. The problem was that anniversary was going to occur only about a year and a half after he arrived in Maine, and he just didn't have time to plan this same kind of grand celebration. He did go on the anniversary of St. Patrick's, but he didn't have enough lead time to turn that event into a greater celebration. He could also have chosen a couple of dates in the 1920s relating to Father Sebastian Rao, an early Jesuit missionary to Maine. There were a couple of bicentennials connected with Rao, but those events would all have been in the 1920s. Too far away, I think, for Bishop Walsh to make anything of them. He wanted to do something sooner rather than later.
So it really was perfect timing.
That's right. And the other thing is that, of course, there was another 300th anniversary at St. Croix on Passamaquoddy Bay. But the 300th anniversary of that had already happened, had already come and gone before Walsh came to Maine. There was a small French missionary settlement there. So that anniversary had passed, making the one in Bar Harbor the one that Walsh focused on.
And he had a lot of material to draw from. All the episodes that you just recited, so many of them are documented in the Jesuit Relations, which is a fundamental document for North American historians and for the history of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely, absolutely. And other historians have relied on those Jesuit relations. The most famous probably was used to Francis Parkman used those Jesuit relations, and it was he who identified what he thought was the site of Saint-Sauveur on the island.
Right. Well, here we're showing an image of Reverend James O'Brien, who for many, many years was the parish priest for first St. Sylvia's that preceded the Holy Redeemer Church, and then for the Holy Redeemer Church itself. And so he watched over a flock, an immigrant flock in Bar Harbor. What was the Catholic presence in Bar Harbor like in 1913?
Yeah, the Catholic presence in Bar Harbor was very small, but perhaps like today, it was small during the year, but grew to several times over in the summer. As people came for the summer. Initially, what Catholics there were on the island, this would be in the 1880s and 90s, maybe about 300 or 400 families, 300 or 400 people, I should say, all together. And initially, priests came over from Ellsworth and would say Mass and would then go back to Ellsworth. But when St. Sylvia's Church was built on Keebo Street, then a priest could be assigned to it permanently. And after an earlier priest, Father O'Brien here came in 1894 and served for 30 years. So he was a prominent local figure and a well-liked local figure.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before to you, Jim, before this started, when the day he died in 1924, every business in town closed down for his funeral. Mm-hmm. He was widely respected. And so it sounds like the history that Walsh was drawing from, he had some selections some specific episodes he wanted to counter, especially episodes of discrimination. So in 1913, it was only 60 so years previously that John Baptist had been tarred and feathered. That's like us thinking back to an event that happened in 1960, which doesn't seem too far-fetched. Seems within a lifetime of memory. Can you tell about the discrimination and what he wanted to counter?
Yeah, the John Baptist incident was the most prominent one, and as you say, there would still have been people alive in 1913 who remembered it, or at least had heard their parents talk about it. John Baptist was a Jesuit missionary from Switzerland originally, who came to the United States and served native Catholic populations in Maine. Um, and while he was in the town of Ellsworth in 1854, there was an upsurge of anti-Catholic sentiment, and a mob seized Father Baptist one evening, stripped him of his clothes, mounted him on a sharp rail, and tarred and feathered him and paraded him around town as a way of expressing their hostility, to say the least. Of the church. Baptist was a tough customer, however, and always proudly said thereafter that the day after the tar and feathering, which was on a Saturday, the day after he said Mass for the Catholics of Ellsworth nonetheless. That's a measure, as we look at this now, that's a measure of the conflict between the various groups. And as I've said, there would have been people, could have been people at the celebration in 1913 who remembered that Father Baptist incident.
And there was a convenience in asserting the legitimacy of Catholic presence on Mount Desert Island, in that while Walsh was pointing to a 300-year-old tradition, the Plymouth landing occurred only 293 years previously.
Right, yeah. Walsh never said it in so many words, but as I studied this, I formed the conclusion that he had this very much in mind. If, as he saw it, Catholics were looked down upon by the Yankee community in New England generally, that looked to the landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620, Walsh could say by indirection, but nonetheless clearly, oh, 1620, Catholics were already here by 1613. Those pilgrims are newcomers. And in fact, in Walsh's sermon, he even tried to reach even farther back. He said he thought it was possible that one day research would show that Christian Vikings had come to Mount Desert, maybe even in the 8th century. And perhaps even St. Brendan, the legendary Irish explorer, had been there in the 6th century. So as I say, his subtle, unstated but pointed message to anybody in the 20th century who was inclined to look down on Catholics would be, you're the newcomers. Catholics are the ones who've been here all along.
Yeah, yeah. So how did he hope that this assertion of Catholic legitimacy would switch the public, would make it have an influence on the public interest?
Yeah, the Catholic community, as I've said, was small, but it was growing, and it was beginning to assert itself in politics and social life. Catholics in Maine were an increasing voting bloc, and the marshaling of forces that Walsh put together for this celebration, again, made a subtle point in that way as well. That's most clearly seen, I think, in a second celebration of the 300th anniversary that was held not in Bar Harbor, but in Portland later that fall, on Columbus Day, in fact, a so-called civic ceremony of 300 years of Catholicism in Maine. A civic ceremony was held in the Portland City Hall in October of 1913. And both the mayor and the governor came to that celebration and made appropriate speeches about the importance of the church in Maine, with thanks for the work that Walsh had done and so on. So Catholics were beginning to assert themselves politically. Now, I think it took a while. I haven't checked this. Unless I'm wrong, I think maybe it was Ed Muskie who was the first Catholic governor of Maine. I stand to be corrected on that. So this assertion of Catholic political power might have taken a long time, but Walsh wanted to make that point as well.
And let's take a closer look at this image. We want to show our audience this really amazing photograph. And the first thing that's striking to me is the presence of these Penobscot and Passamaquoddy people here. And can you just kind of take us through this photograph and what we're looking at here and what's implied in the presence of these people?
Sure. The prominent place in this photograph of the native peoples was quite deliberate. Catholic missionaries from Canada had first come into Maine in the 1600s, and they converted communities of people around Old Town, around Pleasant Point, some in around Orono. And it's interesting, these missionaries converted native peoples to Catholicism. And then it was maybe a couple of hundred years before those Catholic converts saw a priest again after the missionary moved on. And yet they maintained their Catholic identity. It was to help them that Father Baptist had come into the state in 1854. And so they were a very important part of the Catholic community in Maine, older and maybe even more important, you might say, than immigrants from Ireland and French Canada and other parts of the world as well. So the fact that they were included in this ceremony and given such a prominent place, as you see in this photograph, is an indication of is an acknowledgement of the role that they had played in the community. Other than that, Catholics in Maine tended to be working class folks, again, as I've said, from Ireland, from French Canada, other parts of Europe as well. Catholicism, such as it was in Maine in 1913, was concentrated largely in cities. Portland, Biddeford, Lewiston, places like that, with then scattered communities elsewhere. So again, it was that up and coming nature of the Catholic population that Walsh wanted to encourage and promote in this celebration. And
we have a question from our audience. Sam Younger asks, did this event have any connection with Louise Drexel Morrill, her husband, Colonel Morrill, and or her sister, St. Catherine Drexel?
Absolutely, absolutely. Probably the most prominent Catholic layman in Bar Harbor at the time was Colonel Morrill. And in fact, the various dignitaries, the apostolic delegate and the other bishops, they stayed at the Morrill house. That photograph you saw of them together was all on the porch of the Morrill house. So he was a very prominent figure in Bar Harbor, and as the questioner indicated, originally from Philadelphia, he had married into the Drexel family and was a sister-in-law of Catherine Drexel, now Saint Catherine Drexel, who was a woman who formed a community of Catholic sisters to work particularly with African Americans and with Native Americans. In fact, also, I should say, Morrill also donated the land right next to Holy Redeemer Church here, just down the street, for the convent of sisters that staffed this St. Edward's School, which was associated with the parish. And the school was named St. Edward's in honor and in thanks for Edward Morrill.
And that convent, until very recently, housed the Bar Harbor Historical Society. So
that's right. I visited there a couple of summers ago and saw the house, and I had heard that the house was for sale. I don't know if has it been sold since?
You know, I don't know its sales status, but the Bar Harbor Historical Society is very much relocated in La Rochelle, a beautiful building over on West Street.
Okay, good.
Well, we have just a couple of slides left. We want to make sure that we cover what Walsh had to say in his sermon. Not his version of it, but a shorter version of it.
Well, yes, it'll be a shorter version. I won't go the full hour and a quarter, hour and a half that he used. He reviewed the history not just of the community on the island, but the entire history of Catholics in Maine, including though obviously the Saint Sauveur settlement, which was old, undoubtedly that, but in fact, the settlement that he was celebrating was very short-lived. A small group of French military men and settlers and 2 priests landed on the island in May of 1613. And the site is generally thought to be at Fernall's Point on Somme Sound. They landed in May of that year and began to build a settlement. There aren't direct records, but mass was undoubtedly said by the 2 priests who were with them, Fathers Bayard and Massey. And the intention was that this would be a long-standing settlement, rather. But in the fall, in early September, a fleet of English came up from Virginia. Of course, the English claimed this territory as well as the French. The English destroyed the settlement. They took the priests captive. And so this settlement that had begun with such hopes in May of that year was gone by September of that year. And in fact, Catholics hadn't really come back to Maine after that for a couple of hundred years. Even so, Walsh glossed over that a little bit. He even called the settlement a permanent settlement. Well, the intention had been that it would be permanent, but it turned out to be somewhat less so. And nonetheless, from his perspective, marked a 300th anniversary.
And we've been showing you, by the way, the gorgeous images by Jennifer Steen Boer, her photographs of stained glass. That was a feature of this issue of the magazine. And these are from both Holy Redeemer Church and also St. Ignatius Loyola in Northeast Harbor. So you say in your conclusion, Jim, that Walsh used, quote, the past to say something significant about the present. How did he do that?
Yeah, he was interested in these larger messages that the historical celebration could provide. I think we do that with history all the time. The 400th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims. Just yesterday, in fact, was the 400th anniversary of the signing of the Mayflower Compact, the first document of self-government in America. Well, that event is celebrated today, not just for a historical event, but also as a reminder of the importance of self-government and democracy and participation today. Walsh was doing the same thing, I think, with this celebration in Bar Harbor in 1913. Yes, there is this history. Yes, it establishes the Catholic community as an important part of the larger Maine community. So everybody should look on that history as contributing to the larger history of the community.
Well, I think we've continued to do that in our own world this year. This is the bicentennial of Maine statehood.
Right.
Compared it to the centennial of Maine statehood and noted how different the stories that we tell then and now have become, and how much we link them to current events. I don't think we can get away from it.
I think that's right. You know, some people look on history as being irrelevant. It's past, after all. It's over. What's the meaning for that? Obviously, as a historian, I believe just the opposite. History doesn't always have clear, direct, obvious to everybody lessons. But I think if we don't understand our history, if we don't study it, then we're less than we might be. History for a larger community, I think, is like memory for an individual person. And I think in these celebrations in 1913, Bishop Walsh was trying to enhance the memory, not just of Catholics, but of all the people in Maine.
Well, if anyone in our audience has other questions for us, please put them in the chat section of Zoom or in the comments of Facebook. We'd be happy to field them. And if you don't come up with a question until after we're over, we'll reply on our Facebook Live page. Well, I'm not seeing anything immediately. Professor James O'Toole, Department of History at Boston College, it's been a pleasure having you back to talk to us again. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to being back on the island this summer.
Yes, and we'll have to line you up for another article one of these days. We're always trying to rope in good writers.
Happy to do it.
Well, thanks. It's been really great talking to you, Jim.
Thank you.
To our audience, I invite you back next week. I will be talking about George Heflin's Silent Mission. It's a story of how a mysterious inscription at Seawall was deciphered using a lot of resources within the community, and how it tied us to an individual who turned out to be very, very significant in the lives of people in New England. So I hope you'll join us again next Thursday at 4:30. But for now, we'll talk to you soon. Take care, everyone. And Jim, once again, thank you.
Thank you.